They told me to ask my son-in-law for money. My own daughter had just closed on a $14 million real estate deal with her husband, and my wife told me to call the church food pantry instead. That's the kind of sentence that sits in your chest like a stone you can't cough up. I didn't say a word back to Deborah that night. 62 years old, and I just sat there at my own kitchen table. But before I tell you the rest of it, I need you to understand something. This isn't a story about money. It's a story about who shows up when you've got nothing left to give them in return. Let me back up. I live in a small house on Willow Creek Road outside Macon, Georgia. Bought it back in 1994 when I still had both knees working right and a full head of hair. The kind of house you tell yourself you'll fix up someday: new siding, a bigger porch, maybe a sunroom out back. 30 years later, the siding's still the same, faded yellow, and the porch swing has a squeak in it I've gotten used to like an old song. My name is Walter Boyd. I drove a delivery route for a regional freight company for 31 years before my back gave out and I had to take early retirement 3 years ago. My wife Deborah taught third grade for almost as long as I drove that truck, though she'd retired the year before me. We have 2 children. Our daughter Renee is 41 now, married to a man named Preston who made his money, a lot of it flipping distressed commercial properties around Atlanta. Our son Micah is 36. And for the past 9 years, he's worked as a mechanic at a little garage off Highway 41, the kind of place with 2 bays and a coffee pot that's always half burnt. Micah married young, had 2 kids fast, and money has always been the kind of tight where you learn to stretch a pound of ground beef across 4 meals without anybody complaining. It was a Thursday evening in early August, hot enough that the window units were fighting a losing battle when Deborah's phone lit up on the counter. I watched her face do that thing it does. I don't know how else to describe it, except that a switch gets flipped behind her eyes when it's Renee calling. There it is, I thought. The only smile that still shows up easy in this house, and it's never for me anymore. Renee, baby, she said, already halfway to singing it. Tell me everything. I set my glass of tea down. Is that Renee? Let me say hello. She didn't even turn around. She angled her whole body away from me like I was a cold draft coming in through a window she needed to shut. I heard pieces of it anyway. Something about escrow closing. Something about $14 million. The 2 of them, Renee and Preston, closing on some big mixed-use property outside Buckhead that they'd been chasing for the better part of a year. Deborah's voice climbed higher with every sentence, the way it used to climb when we were young, and something good actually happened to us, not just to somebody we raised. I sat there with the mail in front of me. A past due notice from Georgia Power. A thick envelope from Piedmont Healthcare that I already knew wasn't good news, because good news never comes in an envelope that heavy. I'd been putting off opening it for 4 days. See, 6 weeks before that phone call, I'd started getting these headaches that didn't feel like ordinary headaches. Pressure behind my left eye, a kind of static in my ear that came and went. My doctor sent me for scans I didn't want and couldn't really afford, and what came back was a tumor sitting against my optic nerve. Not the kind you can just leave alone and hope for the best. The kind that needs a specialist, a surgical team, and a hospital 3 hours away in Atlanta because nobody in Macon does that particular procedure. The number the surgical coordinator gave me over the phone, after insurance, after everything Medicare and my old supplemental plan would cover, was $4,100. Due before they'd put me on the schedule, I had 11 days. I hadn't told Deborah yet. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because some part of me already knew how the conversation would go, and I wasn't ready to hear it out loud yet. That night, after she hung up with Renee, glowing like she'd won something herself, I finally said it. Deb, I need to talk to you about something serious. She was still smiling from the phone call, wiping down the counter that didn't need wiping. Can it wait? I want to call Renee back. She wants me to help her pick furniture for the new office building. They're renting the top floor out to some tech company. It's about my head, the scans. That got her attention, but only sort of. She sat down across from me, arms crossed, the smile fading into something more like mild inconvenience. I told her about the tumor, about the surgery, about the $4,100, and the 11 days. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, Well, have you called Renee? Not are you scared? Not how bad is it? Have you called Renee? Deb, I'm not asking our daughter for money. Why not? They just closed $14 million, Walter. 14 million. You think they can't spare 4,000 for your father-in-law's head? I'm not her father-in-law. I'm her father. You know what I mean. She waved her hand, like that detail didn't matter. Or call the church. Pastor Nichols has that benevolence fund. People do that all the time. It's not shameful. I sat there and looked at this woman I'd been married to for 33 years, and I understood, maybe for the first time all the way down in my bones, that she had already decided whose comfort mattered more in this house. It wasn't going to be mine. It was going to be whoever could keep that phone lighting up with good news about Buckhead office buildings. I didn't argue. I want you to understand that. I didn't yell. I didn't throw the mail across the table. I didn't do any of the things a man might feel entitled to do in that moment. I just said, okay, because honestly, what else do you say to somebody who's already made up their mind? But I called Renee anyway. Not because Deborah told me to. Because some small, stupid, hopeful part of me still thought my daughter would want to know her father was sick before anybody had to ask her for a thing. She picked up on the fourth ring, breathless, laughing at something Preston must have said in the background. Dad! Hey, sorry, we're in the middle of a walkthrough. Can I call you back tonight? Sure, sweetheart. It's not an emergency. Which was a lie. But I didn't know how to say the true thing fast enough before she was gone again. She called back around 9 that night. I told her about the tumor, the surgery, the $4,100, trying to keep my voice light, the way you do when you don't want to be a burden, even while you're being exactly that. There was a pause on the line. Then, Dad, that's okay, wow, that's scary. But, listen, this really isn't great timing. We just put almost everything liquid into this Buckhead deal, and Preston's very particular about not touching the reserve fund until the renovation draws start coming through. You understand how that works, right? It's not that we don't have money. It's that it's not accessible right now. $14 million, and somehow not 4,000 of it was accessible. I understand, I said. And in a strange way, I did. I understood exactly what kind of daughter I had raised. Have you tried, Micah? She added, and something in the way she said it light, almost relieved to hand the weight off, told me she'd already decided this wasn't going to be her problem. Micah. My son who fixes transmissions for a living, and whose wife clips coupons out of the Sunday paper like it's still 2004. I hadn't even considered calling him because I knew what asking him would mean. It would mean him saying yes before he even knew the number, and then figuring out how to make it work after. I was right. He came by 2 days later, still in his work coveralls, grease under his fingernails the way it always is no matter how many times he scrubs. He sat down across from me at the same kitchen table, and I told him the same thing I'd told his sister. Tumor. Surgery. $4,100. 11 days. Now down to 9. He didn't say a word about liquidity or reserve funds. He just said, okay, we'll figure it out. Micah, I'm not asking you. I know you're not asking. I'm telling you. We'll figure it out. Then quieter, like he was almost embarrassed to say it. Dad, I don't have $4,000 sitting around. You know that. But I've got some tools I don't use anymore. And Tammy's got that old Camry we've been meaning to sell since we got the truck, and I can pick up extra shifts. Give me a few days. I told him no. I told him it was too much, that a man his age with 2 little kids at home shouldn't be selling his wife's car for his father's medical bills, while his sister sat on 14 million and called it not accessible. He looked at me the way his mother used to look at me 30 years ago, back before something in her hardened over. Dad, you drove that truck for 31 years so Renee and me could eat and have shoes that fit. I'm not letting you go under a scalpel worrying about money. That's not up for discussion. Over the next week, Micah sold that Camry to a guy 2 towns over for $2,600. He picked up every extra shift the garage would give him, working till 9 some nights, coming home smelling like brake fluid and exhaustion. Tammy took a part-time job doing the books for a little flower shop downtown, something she hadn't done since before their youngest was born. Between the two of them, and a few $100s Micah got for an old tool chest he'd inherited from his own father-in-law, they scraped together the $4,100 4 days before my surgery date. He drove up to Willow Creek Road on a Sunday afternoon and set an envelope on my kitchen table. Not a check. Cash. folded into a rubber band, like he didn't trust anything electronic to move fast enough. Micah, I can't take this from you. You already did? He said, and smiled the way he used to smile as a boy when he'd fixed something nobody thought could be fixed. It's done, Dad. Don't make me feel bad about doing the right thing. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I did. A man who drives a 14-year-old truck, who packs his kids' lunches instead of buying the school hot lunch because it's $2 cheaper, sold his wife's car so his father could get a tumor removed from behind his eye. And his sister with the $14 million real estate deal couldn't find $4,000. Deborah found out 3 days before the surgery, when Tammy mentioned it in passing at church, thinking Deborah already knew. I watched my wife's face go through something complicated when she realized her son had sold his wife's car while her daughter sat on all that money and did nothing. Well, she said finally, at least it's handled. That was it. That was the whole of her reaction. At least it's handled. Not a word of shame that it was our other child, the one drowning in bills, who'd handled it, while the one swimming in millions had waved it off like a mosquito she didn't feel like swatting. The surgery itself, I won't dwell on too long, except to say it went as well as these things go. 6 hours on the table, a surgeon named Dr. Okafor who talked to me afterward like I was a person and not a chart, and a recovery that was slow but steady. Micah drove up to Atlanta twice that week, 3 hours each way, on top of working full shifts at the garage. Renee sent a fruit basket to the house. An actual fruit basket, the kind you order online in about 90 seconds without ever having to think about the person receiving it. There was a card. It said, "Get well soon, Dad. Love, R and P." She hadn't even signed her own name in full. Here's the part I haven't told anybody outside this family, and it's the part that changes everything that comes after. I never told Deborah or Renee or even Micah about the settlement. 15 years ago, before I retired from driving, there was an accident on I-75, a chemical company's transport truck, jackknifed and spilled a load that closed the highway for 2 days and contaminated groundwater near 3 properties, including a small parcel of land my own father had left me, 40 acres out past Gray, Georgia, that I'd never done anything with except pay the taxes on it and let it sit. It took 12 years, 3 law firms, and a class action settlement that finally paid out in full 4 years ago. I never made a show of it. I paid off the house, quietly, in cash. I kept driving my same truck. I kept clipping coupons right alongside Tammy, if I'm honest, because old habits don't disappear just because a number in a bank account changes. What was left, after taxes and legal fees, was just over $2.1 million, sitting untouched in an account Deborah didn't know existed, because I'd opened it under my late father's trust before we'd even married, and it had simply never come up. I want to be honest with you. Part of the reason I never told her wasn't caution. It was a slow, creeping realization, over years, that the woman I married had started keeping a ledger in her head of who was worth her warmth and who wasn't, based on nothing but the size of the number attached to their name. I'd watched her warm up around Renee's success like a cat finding a patch of sun, and I'd watched her cool toward Micah's struggle like it was something contagious. I didn't want to find out what she'd do with $2 million in the mix. Some part of me already knew. 3 weeks after my surgery, once I was steady enough to sit up for longer than 20 minutes at a stretch, I called a lawyer named Franklin Ozoemena, who'd handled the settlement case for me years back, and I asked him to help me set something up. Not a will, a living, irrevocable trust, funded immediately, naming Micah and his 2 children as primary beneficiaries, with a smaller provision, not nothing, but modest set-aside for Renee, structured in a way that made it very clear it wasn't punishment. Exactly. But it also wasn't going to fund any more buckhead deals. It took 6 weeks to finalize. During those 6 weeks, life at the house went on the way it always had. Deborah made dinner every night, same as ever, still lighting up when Renee's name came across her phone screen, still asking Micah, whenever she saw him, whether the garage was still doing all right, in that tone that always made it sound like she expected the answer to be no. I sat through all of it. I let it happen. Not because I was scared, and not because I was planning some grand reveal like you see in movies. I just wanted to be sure, all the way down, before I said anything. The day the trust was finalized, I asked Deborah, Renee, Preston, and Micah to all come to the house on a Saturday afternoon. I told them it was about my will, since my health scare had gotten me thinking about getting things in order. That part, at least, was true. Renee showed up 20 minutes late, in a car I didn't recognize, talking on the phone the whole walk up the driveway about a contractor delay on the Buckhead property. Preston came in behind her, checking his own phone, barely making eye contact with me. Micah came straight from the garage, still in his coveralls, apologizing for the grease on his hands before he even said hello. We sat around the same kitchen table where this whole thing had started. I had Franklin there, too, sitting quietly at the end of the table with a folder in front of him, because I wanted this done properly, with a witness who understood exactly what these papers meant. I started by thanking everybody for coming. I told them the surgery had gone well, that I was healing, that I was grateful. Deborah reached over and patted my hand like we were a normal, warm family having a normal, warm conversation, and something in me went very still and very clear. Then I told them about the settlement, about the $2.1 million that had been sitting quietly in an account for 4 years. I watched Deborah's face change the way it changes for Renee's phone calls, except this time it was pointed at me, and I understood, with a kind of sadness that surprised me, that even now, even hearing this, what was lighting up behind her eyes wasn't relief that I was healthy. It was the number. "Walter," she said, "why on earth didn't you tell me? We could have." "Could have what, Deb? Called Renee sooner? Skipped asking Micah to sell his wife's car?" She didn't have an answer for that. Renee had gone quiet. For possibly the first time in the whole conversation, phone finally set face down on the table. Preston sat up a little straighter. I slid the folder across the table to Franklin, and he opened it and read through the terms of the trust in that calm, unhurried lawyer's voice, the full amount, minus the modest provision for Renee, placed into an irrevocable trust for Micah and his children, structured so that it couldn't be touched, borrowed against, or redirected by anyone, including me, for the next 20 years, protecting it specifically from claims, creditors, or, Franklin said, reading directly from the document, any current or future spouse. "You're cutting me out," Renee said. Not a question. Flat, like she was reading a line off a script she couldn't quite believe she'd been handed. "I'm not cutting you out, Renee. There's a provision for you in there. It's just not $14 million worth. This is insane. This is Dad, this is our money too, this is family money." "It was my money," I said, and I kept my voice level, because I'd promised myself I wouldn't raise it, not once, not that day. It sat in an account for 4 years while I drove the same truck and clipped the same coupons, because I wanted to see what this family actually was when nobody was watching the number, and I found out. Micah sold his wife's car for $4,000 while you were closing on $14 million and called it not accessible. Your mother told me to call the church. Deborah flinched at that, actually flinched, like I'd reached across the table and touched something tender. Preston finally spoke, low and careful. "Walter, with respect, this seems like an emotional decision made during a health crisis. Maybe once you've had time to—" "Preston, I've had 6 weeks to think about very little else. This isn't emotional. This is the clearest thinking I've done in years." Micah hadn't said a word through any of it. When I finally looked at him, his eyes were wet, and he shook his head slightly, like he wanted to object on principle even though every part of him needed it. "Dad, I don't need. I know you don't need it, Micah. That's exactly why it's yours." Renee stood up so fast her chair scraped hard against the floor. "This is unbelievable. You're rewarding him for being poor and punishing me for being successful." "No, sweetheart. And I want you to know," I said it gently, because underneath 30 years of watching her become this, she was still my daughter, and it still hurt to say. "I'm rewarding the child who showed up when I had nothing to offer in return. You didn't show up for $4,000. I don't imagine you'd have shown up for 400. She didn't have anything to say to that. Neither did Deborah. They left together, Preston trailing behind, checking his phone one more time before he reached the door, and the house went quieter than I think I'd ever heard it in 33 years of marriage. Micah stayed behind after they left. He sat there at the table for a long while, turning a coffee mug slowly between his hands, not really drinking from it. "I don't want you and Mom to end up like this because of me," he finally said. You didn't do this, son. I did. Your mother and sister did their part too. All you did was sell a car and show up when it mattered. That's not a debt. That's just who you are. He cried a little then, quiet. The kind of crying a grown man does when he's spent his whole life being the one who doesn't get noticed for doing the right thing. And finally somebody noticed. It's been 4 months now. Deborah and I are still under the same roof, though something between us has cooled into a kind of careful, distant courtesy. We're not fighting, but we're not what we were either, and I've made peace with the idea that we may never be again. Renee calls sometimes, shorter conversations than before, less warmth in them, though I notice she asks about my health now before she asks about anything else, which is more than she used to do. Micah bought Tammy a car 2 months ago. Not new, not fancy, just reliable, with actual seatbelts in the back that click the way they're supposed to. He tried to pay me back for the trust the way he'd pay back a loan, and I told him there was nothing to pay back, that some debts are only meant to run in one direction, and this was one of them. Sometimes I sit out on that porch swing with the squeak I never fixed, and I think about that Thursday evening, Deborah's face lit up by a phone call that wasn't for me, and how close I came to letting that be the whole story, a tired old man who asked for help and got told to call the pastor instead. But it isn't the whole story. Because when I had nothing left to offer, when there was no $14 million behind my name, and no promise of anything coming back, my son sold his wife's car and drove 3 hours each way to sit with me in a hospital room, and that told me more about him than 31 years of raising him ever had. You find out who your family really is, I've learned, not when you've got something to give them. You find out when you don't.